Thank you for joining us. Take it away, Rich.
All righty. All right, we'll get that out of the way. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. This is going to be exciting. We are going to have a lot of fun. I think we're going to all relive a few good memories together and perhaps teach you a few things you didn't know about this great American road trip experience. All right, so obviously we are here to talk about family road trips tonight. You see that I have a nice PowerPoint presentation all prepared for you, and hopefully it's going to go now. I think I can guess what you're thinking. You're thinking, hey, goody, a slideshow of all this guy's family vacations that he ever took from the 1970s. I know that, and if you guessed that, you're absolutely right. So get comfy, sit back, because for the next 3 hours, I have so many great photos to share. No. I'm sorry to disappoint you all. Unfortunately, my parents were not the type to take many photos, and actually the ones that they did take were almost universally dreadful. And in case you don't believe me, I do have a few to show you. So yeah, up there in the upper left-hand corner, that's a lovely picture of my family and I in front of the White House. You might be able to make out in the blurriness. And then, that central photo right in the middle there, that's a picture of the, I think that was the space shuttle or one of the rockets down at Cape Canaveral. My dad almost actually got the rocket in the photo. I think it's off to the left there a little bit. And then up in the upper right-hand corner, that's little me standing in front of a horse-drawn carriage at Jackson Square in New Orleans. Yeah, maybe it's a little bit muddy, but so these are basically the photos my family has to help us recollect all the great trips that we took. And I think now you understand why I had to write a book, right? Because we all know that 1,000 words tells a picture anyway. And oh, by the way, who am I anyways? And what is this book that I've written here? Don't Make Me Pull Over, an informal history of the family road trip. Well, my name is Richard Rattay, and that's little me here in second grade, I think. And I am a local guy. That is, if you're local to Wisconsin and the greater Milwaukee area, where I'm speaking to you from even now. I was the youngest of 4 kids, and by a pretty good margin too. My brothers were 8 and 7 years older than me. Also had a sister who was 5 years older than me. And years later, when I was a little bit more grown, my very Catholic mother confided to me that I was their extra special blessing. So I came around at the tail end, and that basically made me akin to luggage for two long road trips that we would take every year throughout the 1970s and 80s. Okay, now about the book. The book is what I call a pop history memoir, and you're probably wondering what that is. Well, it's a combination. It's kind of a hybrid book. So it's about 20%, 25% of fun family stories that happened to us while we were traveling the highways and byways of America, mostly during the 1970s and into the 1980s. It's also 50% fun history that we'll soon be getting into a little bit. Stuff like how America got its interstate highway system, how we got some of those fun gadgets that we all had in our cars, like fuzzbusters and 8-track tape decks and all that good stuff. And I also throw in some pop culture references to really invite you into that back seat with me and experience, and for many of you, I think, re-experience what traveling the highways of the 60s and 70s and 80s really was like, and hopefully stir up some fun family memories. Specifically, what am I talking about? I'm talking about stuff like station wagons. I think it was mandatory for every family to own one of those great Ford Country Squire station wagons at some point during at least the 1970s, right? With that great fake wood panel siding on there. We're also going to be visiting some of those great roadside attractions along the way in the course of our reading, including stuff like the world's largest chicken frying pan. And if you can believe it, there wasn't just one community that claimed to own the world's largest chicken frying pan. There were actually at one point, six cities across America that claimed to have the world's largest chicken frying pan. I also get into some of those great video games that could be found in the game rooms of the motels that we would stop at. And boy, I would be excited to go whenever we stopped at a motel, to go and seek out the game room right away and see what video games they had in store for me. We'll also talk about some of those great games that we as families all played in the cars along the way, and beyond stuff like the alphabet game and I Spy. One of my personal family favorites was Mad Libs, which I was excited to learn is actually still around, and they're still being played in families who do take road trips today. Of course, I get into some of those great chains that could be found at the side of America's highways, especially the motel chains like Holiday Inn and Howard Johnson's. I explain how we got some of those great rest areas that we would somehow have to take a visit at, although my dad wasn't very fond of actually stopping at any of those rest areas. He was one of those dads that was always about what he called making time, and which essentially meant just getting to the day's destination as fast as humanly possible. And so he didn't like to stop to let any of us to use the rest areas. And I'm convinced to this day that my bladder is about 6 times the size of the average human's, because of it getting stretched out while in the name of making time for my dad. We talk about more of those great roadside attractions, including the world's largest ball of twine that my dad was always threatening to take us to. There were actually, for years, for decades actually, there were 2 dueling balls of twine, one located in Cawker City, Kansas, and the other, the original, some say, in Darwin, Minnesota. I explain why we went from traveling at speeds of 70 and 75 and even 80 miles an hour for a while, or for the years leading up to the 1970s. And suddenly we had a national maximum highway speed limit of 55 miles an hour during the Nixon and Carter administrations and lasting into the 1980s. I talk about, again, some of those great gadgets that we had in the cars. Of course, the 1970s was the era of the CB craze, as many of us might recall, when there were more than 25 million licensed CB users, and we were all talking in that CB talk like 10-4 good buddy, and talking about life on the super slab, and using that CB kind of jargon. Also talk about how we got things like fuzzbusters, radar guns, some of the great candy that we would be eating in our cars, including Pop Rocks. How about some of those candy buttons? I even have some of this stuff. Candy buttons. You remember this stuff that you had to peel off the paper backing? And we were even smoking some of those candy cigarettes in the back, or at least I was, in the way back of our station wagon. And sometimes I would get some of those double takes from other cars when they would pull up alongside of us on the highway, surprised to see an 8-year-old child in the way back of the station wagon, what looked to be like smoking on a Camel cigarette. In other words, I am talking about all the stuff that made up the greatest, the best family vacations ever. Okay, so I guess the big question is, why do so many of us have those great memories of road trips? And the answer is that so many of us were taking them. It was really during the 1960s and 70s, maybe the latter half of the 1950s is what I call the golden era of the family road trip, when the number of families hitting the highways absolutely exploded. And as evidence, I point to a few key statistics. During the 17-year period from 1955 to 1972 alone, attendance at America's national parks exploded from 62 million visitors a year to 165 million visitors, so almost tripling in just a 17-year period. It was also a time when people were very interested in learning about and visiting America's historic sites. Attendance at Washington, D.C. and all the landmarks around Washington, D.C. doubled during the 1960s alone. So attendance doubled at the White House, at the Lincoln Memorial, at places like the Washington Monument. Families were going to our nation's capital in droves to learn about America's history. Of course, it was also during the 1960s that JFK and NASA kind of inadvertently, or just as a sidelight, created one of America's biggest tourist attractions in the space program. For every launch during NASA's, let's see, I guess the order was Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo space missions, you would have hundreds of thousands of people travel down to Florida and show up on the Space Coast to actually witness those launches take place live, of course, culminating with the launch of Apollo 11, when it's estimated that well more than 1 million people lined the beaches of Florida to watch the launch of the Apollo 11 rocket. And then, of course, 650 million, more than 500 million people would later watch the moon landing take place live on television from around the world. So an incredible experience there. Of course, really one of the things that signaled the beginning of the great American road trip experience was the opening of Disneyland out in Anaheim, California in 1955. And actually, this was an event that took place live. It was broadcast live on ABC TV. One of the hosts of the event was a then kind of fading leading man. He'd starred in a few Westerns. Trying to think of what his name was again. Oh, that's right. It was Ronald Reagan. I'm not sure if he went on to do anything after that event, but I guess he was a pretty good host for Disneyland. Disneyland became a huge popular attraction right away. Obviously, Walt Disney was a very popular figure during the 1960s and had his own television show and was able to showcase his new theme park. But he quickly discovered that he had a bit of a problem. While the park was very successful, he did some surveys of the people, the visitors that were coming to his park, and learned that 90% of them were coming from original locations that were west of the Mississippi River. And of course, the vast majority of the American population lived in the cities of the Northeast. So he quickly began plans to launch another version of Disneyland on the East Coast. And just 16 years later, of course, he accomplished his mission with the opening of Walt Disney World in 1971. Now, of course, Walt wasn't around to see the opening. He'd actually passed away of lung cancer, but his brother Roy supervised the final years of construction and saw the opening of Disney World in 1971. Of course, today, Disney World is still, by a good margin, the world's most popular man-made tourist attraction. And many families are, of course, still making that pilgrimage down to Florida to have that Walt Disney World experience. With the success of Disneyland in 1955, of course, more theme parks soon followed, and they became popular destinations for families to travel to. There was the opening of Six Flags in Texas. You know, whenever I have a live audience, I always like to ask if people know why Six Flags, or how Six Flags got its name, why it's named Six Flags. It became this chain. It stands for the six flags that have at one period of time or another flown over Texas. Of course, the flags of Spain, France, Mexico, the Confederacy, the Republic of Texas, and the United States. And that's how the chain of theme parks Six Flags really got its name. Meanwhile, in a little bit south of Disneyland, still in California, way down in San Diego, a group of six fraternity brothers got the idea to open SeaWorld. They originally intended to open in what was to be an underwater restaurant where diners would be able to have dinner and then look at the fish swimming through a glass wall. But they quickly discovered that idea was a little too expensive. And so they converted over to the idea of just kind of having an aquatic park where people would be able to walk around various pools and look at various aquatic life. Their big break was due to a bad date that took place up in Seattle. The director of the Seattle Public Aquarium tried to acquire a mate for his orca that he had in captivity up there, sent a team out into Puget Sound to find his male orca a female mate, and they were able to capture one. They brought her in, and things did not go well from the outset. This female and the male did not get along, and so the aquarium found itself having to get rid of a killer whale in an awful big hurry. And luckily for the founders of SeaWorld, they were able to acquire that female killer whale, and of course, her name was the very famous Shamu, and that became a huge popular attraction for years and years down at SeaWorld. In fact, when she had her own offspring, they named one of them Shamu, and it went right down the line. They kept naming one of the orcas a Shamu so that they could keep up this popular Shamu show that became famous around the world. 1971, Kings Island opened in Cincinnati. That was really the first of the real theme parks. They became very famous for their roller coasters, and that initiated kind of a rivalry between theme parks that were being built in the 1970s to build bigger, better, faster roller coasters. Each one of those theme parks throughout the Midwest and early across the country became a major destination for families to go to. And then in 1977, we have the opening of the first water park with Wet and Wild in Orlando. And that water park was actually opened up by one of the fraternity brothers that had been a founder of SeaWorld. And do you know how he got the idea? By this time, SeaWorld had also had another location in Orlando. And whenever he would go out roaming the park under the baking Florida sun, he would constantly have visitors come up and tell him, saying, hey, you know, we're having a great time here looking at all the animals, but oh my gosh, it is so hot out here. I almost wish that I could get in the pools with the actual animals. And of course, this had a light bulb go off in his mind. So I'll create an aquatic park for humans. And that was the genesis of the first water park with Wet and Wild in 1977. Of course, all of this is just to say that during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, everyone was on the go. We were all getting in our cars and with our families and heading somewhere. So why this sudden interest in taking road trips all across America and across the country? What inspired America's wanderlust? And really, the short answer in so many ways is that it was World War II. After all, it was in training and preparing for the war, that really whisked millions of young men off of their farms across America and out of their urban neighborhoods and sent them off to train at locations across America, particularly in warm weather states and warm weather locations like California and Texas and North Carolina, and in particular Florida, where during the height of the war, there was 400 military installations where men were stationed and were trained. And in fact, at Camp Blanding in Florida alone, they became that camp became the 5th most populous city in Florida. And of course, sometimes the soldiers would have their downtime. They would be able to go out and explore the beaches of Florida. And for many of these young men, it was their first time getting away from their farm or out of their particular city where they lived in, and really getting to see this big, beautiful country of America. And so after the war, many of these men wanted to return to these locations where they had trained, and in particular, Florida, of course. And of course, they brought their young families with them. So that's what inspired a lot of the wanderlust. Of course, it was also during the war that America's car factories really learned to improve their production techniques, especially working with steel while building things like Jeeps and aircraft. And after the war, this really paid off for them. They were able to create much better, much more fancy and much more efficient automobiles, and for a lower price. And so it allowed many families to buy very nice new cars for the first time, giving them transportation. It was also during World War II that America, of course, experienced an incredible economic boom, obviously with the devastation that the war wreaked across Europe. Much of their manufacturing capacity was destroyed, and they looked to America to purchase their products. And this initiated quite an economic boom for America. For workers, it meant they were making a lot more money. And for the first time, they were also getting paid vacations. Many unions in particular, for the first time, were able to negotiate paid vacation into the employment contracts of their workers. So suddenly people found that they had extra money and extra time on their hands, and that's what allowed them to go on vacations. Of course, it was also the period of the baby boom, when the greatest generation of Americans got down to creating an even greater generation, at least in terms of numbers, right? So add it all up, and you had all of these young men and families that had been bitten by the travel bug. They had cars for the first time. They had money to spend, and they had kids to entertain. And really, it all added up to America taking this, going on their family trips, on family road trips. But in particular, why was everyone driving? Of course, today we would just get on board an airplane and quickly travel to wherever we want to go, right? Well, the plain fact is that air travel was incredibly expensive during this period of time. On average, airfares cost anywhere from 2 to 8 times as much. Of course, the number of routes was more limited than what we have today. And in many ways, sure, people like to look back fondly on this era as kind of the golden era of air travel. As you can see, they were serving wonderful meals. They all had wonderful space. You could kind of spread out. But it was really a golden era of air travel only for those who had the gold. Very expensive, and especially out of the reach for most American families who had kids to pay for as well. One of the things that I found as a really kind of a staggering statistic in the research of my book was that as late as 1975, 4 in 5 Americans, 80% of Americans had never traveled by plane, not to go on spring break or to take the kids to see grandma and grandpa or to travel anywhere by plane. Really incredible to think about when we kind of take for granted how much we travel by airplane today. Okay, so who got us rolling on road trips? It was this gentleman, the gentleman that you see seated behind the wheel there. He was a young surgeon by the name of Horatio Jackson. And of course, he has a companion who I'll introduce you to soon. And you might even see popping up above the dashboard of the car there, a little dog face as well, and we'll get to meet all of those shortly. It's really one of the greatest stories in all of American road travel. The first attempt to cross America by car actually began, as many bad ideas do, on a bet after a night of drinking. So this young doctor, Horatio Jackson, took his new bride, Bertha, out on a vacation to the West Coast. They lived in Vermont, but he took her on a vacation out to the West Coast. Some say that he was actually recovering from a mild bout of tuberculosis. But while he was staying out there, he met a friend, and the two went out drinking one night. They went to San Francisco's University Club. And Jackson soon found himself embroiled in debate with another member of the club out there about these new contraptions called automobiles, and whether they were just a passing fancy or whether they were the future of transportation. I should mention here that the year was 1903. So this is a time when, cars are still first just appearing on the American scene. And so he was getting into this argument with a member of the club out there. And for some reason, Horatio Jackson decided he felt so strongly in his stance that he got up and declared, "Why, automobiles are already so rugged and reliable that I can, on this day, drive one clear across the country, back home to my home in Vermont. Well, this is kind of a crazy assertion, and this is at a time when there's barely any roads even built west of the Mississippi River. So needless to say, Jackson is challenged on this, and the two gentlemen set a wager. It wasn't a great deal. It was just $50, which is about $1,500 in today's money. It didn't mean much to Jackson. He was a wealthy man. He was a surgeon, and his wife was pretty wealthy herself. So that didn't mean a great deal. But probably what Jackson did regret was having to live up to this bet that he'd made, and also to explain the bet that he'd made to his new bride the next morning when he got up. Now, Bertha was a smart woman. She immediately booked passage on a train back to their home in Vermont and said, you know what, Horatio, write me some letters, let me know how it's going. I'm going to be relaxing back home. To Horatio's credit, he actually did write her during the course of his trip. But, you know, Horatio was no dumb guy himself. He was smart enough to hire a young crack mechanic, a 25-year-old kid by the name of Sewell Crocker. On Crocker's recommendation, he bought a 20-horsepower Winton touring car, which was a very high-quality, rugged automobile, and he named it Vermont, of course, after Horatio Jackson's home state and the destination that he hoped to get to. So the two loaded up the Winton touring car with all manner of camping equipment and cooking equipment and guns and food and anything you would think to take on a long cross-country expedition across America. And by far the smartest move they'd made was to plan a good route. So starting in San Francisco, the thing that had doomed most attempts to cross the country earlier by car was people tried to go right from the coast and head over the Rocky Mountains. And Jackson and Crocker were a little smarter than that. They said, you know what, we're going to head due north and then follow essentially the path of the Oregon Trail to the east. And that turned out to be a much smarter plan. But still, things did not get off to a good start. It was a rough start, in fact. Only 15 miles in, they blew a tire, requiring them to use their only spare tire. A little while after that, they discovered their headlights were too dim. You can kind of see these kerosene lamps. They're on either side of the car. So they weren't able to make progress at night. So they made a stop off at another merchant in order to acquire the spotlight, which you can see now mounted on the front of the car there, so that they could do some traveling at night as well. At one point, they got bad directions from a woman who sent them 108 miles out of their way simply because she wanted some of her extended family members to get their first look at one of these new contraptions called an automobile. Of course, they had more flats. At some points, they had to tie some of that thick rope that you might find on a ship around the rims of their wheels, just so that they could keep making progress to the next town where they could get new spare tires. Not surprisingly, at a time when there were barely any roads west of the Mississippi, there weren't any service stations either, so they frequently ran out of gas. At one point, Jackson had to rent a bike with some gas cans strapped to his back. Of course, even the tires on the bike flat. And all of this happened before they even departed the West Coast. But eventually, along the way, they meet this adorable young creature, a pit bull by the name of Bud. Some say that Jackson purchased him. Others say that he was a stray that Jackson simply picked up along the way. And as soon as they picked up Bud, it seemed to change their luck. Although while they were traveling across the acrid salt flats of Utah, they noticed that the dust getting kicked up by the tires would kind of get in Bud's eyes and cause his eyes to tear. And so Jackson, being a generous man, stopped off and had some custom goggles made for Bud, as you can see here. And this really turned out to be a good thing for the trio, because the press they just ate this up. Word began to spread of this trio and their effort to try and cross America by car, and photographers would turn out at every city that they drove through. And really, the three became national celebrities before they even got east of the Mississippi River. When they did get east of the Mississippi River, the going got a little bit easier. There were more roads built in some of the built up areas. And just 63 days later, the trio rolled into Times Square in New York City, greeted as national heroes. 63 days, so just a little over 2 months. That 20-hour trip down to Disney World doesn't seem to be so bad now, does it? All right, so what else do I talk about in the book? I go into a little bit about how America got its roads. And you may be surprised to learn that it wasn't really cars that got America building its first modern roads. It was actually bicycles, and in particular, these types of bicycles, what were called safety bicycles. Up until the invention of the safety bicycle, of course, people just had the penny farthings, which were those big wheeled bicycles with the pedals attached to the big wheel. It would require the rider to sit up 4, even 5 feet. And of course, if you fell off a bicycle like that, you were liable to break an arm or a collarbone. And so really, until safety bicycles came along, bicycling had been limited as kind of a daring sport for young men. Really what these safety bicycles and the design of the safety bicycle, which brought the pedals down so that the rider could sit on a seat that kept his feet within easy distance of the ground, really, the safety bicycle democratized bicycle riding and made it accessible to older citizens, to women, to kids. And really, bicycling exploded as a sport during the 1980s and 90s. But the thing that people found was, sure, they loved riding their bicycle around the city, but they wanted to keep going. They wanted to ride out into the country. And so it was really these bicycling clubs that formed that inspired the Good Roads movement and the building of America's first roads. I also explain how America got its first interstates. And really, one of the surprising things to think about is how young our interstates in America really are. Of course, President Eisenhower passed legislation which initiated the construction of the interstates in 1956. So only about 65 years ago, which is not a great deal of time. You start thinking about all the things that have been around longer than America's highway interstate system or interstate highway system. Microwave ovens have been around longer than America's highway interstate system. David Hasselhoff, the Hoff of Baywatch fame, has been around longer than the first of America's interstate highways. The Today Show on NBC has been on the air longer than America's interstate highway system. And, with all the talk about the royals, the British royals in the news lately, it got me to thinking, the Queen of England, Elizabeth, has been the reigning monarch of England for a period of time longer than we have had the first of our interstate highways here in America. So really, these these interstate highways that we take so granted for today really haven't been around long. In fact, they were still building them while my family was out traveling them during the 1960s and 70s. So why did we build the interstates? Well, the short answer is that the roads were jammed. And of course, the Cold War was heating up. Really, President Eisenhower wanted to build the interstate highway system not only to facilitate speedy, safe, and transcontinental transportation, but also because he was really worried about the ability of America's military to get around the country in the event that war came about. And in particular, he was very worried about protecting the West Coast, so that he wanted to make sure that we had highways that would allow military vehicles to travel quickly to America's West Coast, but also to allow dwellers in America's inner cities, in places like Chicago and Kansas City and the bigger cities across America, to allow citizens to get out of cities quickly and evacuate in the event of an atomic attack. Of course, the interstate highway systems were a revolutionary new type of highway. They were called super highways for a reason. They were the first highways that were really designed for speed. And what did that mean specifically? It meant, of course, that there were no at-grade crossings or intersections. Of course, that's why our interstates have overpasses and underpasses to keep traffic flowing in all directions. Of course, most of our interstates were also 4 lanes. They're elevated to prevent flooding, and they're restricted spaces. Of course, only motorized traffic is allowed on our interstates. And so this was really a change compared to the roadways that Americans had experienced prior to the building of the interstate system. When the interstate system was initially passed, it was estimated that they would take $30 billion to construct, and it would take about 10 years for workers to build them. Of course, as we know in hindsight, those estimates were just a trifle off. In the end, it took about $130 billion to build America's interstate highway system. And at that time, it was the most expensive peacetime project in the history of the world to build America's interstates. Of course, it also took a little bit longer than those 10 years to actually build them as well. It actually took closer to 25 years. They were still building the first of America's planned interstates into the early 1980s. But really overnight, these new superhighways transformed America. They made this big country of America instantly so much smaller. For the first time, really, it opened up all these destinations for American families to realistically be able to travel to. All these places that they'd only been able to read about previously, places like New York City and Washington, D.C. and New Orleans, places that they'd only been able to read about in newspapers and magazines. Now they were able to travel to and take their families along, just given ownership of a car and a few dollars for gasoline. Now, I also, of course, in the course of the book, get into some of America's favorite roadside attractions, places like the Mystery Spot in Santa Cruz, California, a place where they claimed that the laws of physics did not apply, as this gentleman off to the left-hand side is demonstrating. Of course, the real secret of the Mystery Spot was that they had simply built a cockeyed cabin on the side of a hill and didn't build many windows into the design of the cabin to allow people to have any perspective and get their bearings, by looking outside. Of course, other roadside attractions also became quite famous. Down in Weeki Wachee, Florida, were the famous mermaid shows that became famous not just across the country, but around the world. They'd been attended by luminaries like Elvis Presley, a variety of presidents. Of course, Esther Williams also was down there frequently, and that became a very popular stop for many families. Down in America's Southwest, The Thing became one of the most popular attractions, and it's still there to this day. In order to promote this mysterious thing located, I think it's called in Canyon Creek, Arizona, there were more than 250 billboards posted along the highways in and around Canyon Creek promoting this mysterious thing. And I'm not going to give away what the big secret of the thing is here, but all I can say is the guy behind it was also responsible for many vaudeville and circus side acts. So that should kind of clue you in as to the quality of that particular attraction. Of course, many people to this day are still stopping at Wall Drug out in San Diego. Anybody making that long expedition to go see Mount Rushmore from anywhere east is probably having to go through South Dakota. And there aren't many places to stop out there. So Wall Drug has kind of monopolized the roadside attraction out there. Way back in 1936, the owner of Wall Drug's wife came up with the idea, and Wall Drug was just a simple pharmacy back then, but she came up with the great idea of promoting free ice water to anyone who stops there. And this became an incredibly popular draw. Of course, when you're driving for miles through a hot desert like they have in South Dakota, the allure of free ice water becomes a lot more appealing. And if you've been to Wall Drug lately, you know it's essentially the Mall of America located out in South Dakota. It is a huge facility now. All right, during the course of the book, I also get into, of course, how we got some of those rest areas, why many of us weren't wearing seat belts. Of course, those of us who took up residence in the back seats of our cars. I think one of the first things my brothers and I did when we got into the back seat of our car before a long family trip was to actually bury those seat belts down in between the seats so we wouldn't have to sit on those sharp buckles throughout the course of the trip. I also go into how America got its many drive-through windows at its fast food restaurants, why the speed limit came down from a rapid 70 to 55, how we got many of those great chains like Holiday Inn, Howard Johnson's, and Stuckey's. Stuckey's, incidentally, of course, anybody who's traveled in America's Southeast is probably very familiar with them and their famous pecan candies. They almost became, went bankrupt a few years ago. And I've actually been in touch with Stephanie Stuckey, who is the granddaughter of the founder of the original Stuckey. And she's actually doing a great job revitalizing the brand. And so I think you might be expecting to see the return of Stuckey's in coming years. Of course, I go into how we got some of those great devices that we had in our cars, things like 8-track tape decks. Actually, the 8-track tape deck was not originally built for cars at all. It was actually invented by Bill Lear. And if that name sounds familiar, you probably heard of Lear jets. And it was because he actually created 8-track tape decks as kind of a luxury audio device to be put into his Lear jets so that people who bought his jets could listen to music without it skipping during turbulence. I also go into how we got things like cruise control, how we got things like how the police got their radar guns and how consumers came to combat them with fuzzbusters of their own so they wouldn't get caught speeding. And of course, I go into how we got those great station wagons that everybody loves and explain why we still have why we still had those fake wood paneled sides on some of our most beloved station wagons, especially during the 1960s and 70s. And of course, I share some great fun family stories to help bring back some of your own memories as well. And it's kind of funny, along the course of writing this book and then doing presentations to various groups, I found that many of these stories that I thought that were so unique to our families were actually universal experiences that just about every family who ever traveled the highways during the same period also experienced. So I think it stirs up a lot of fun memories. All right, we have reached that point of the presentation when sometimes I am told to shut up and finally read something from your book, and let's see what this book is all about. And so the passage that I have settled on today is a little passage that I call the Battle of E. And it has to do with an ongoing debate that always took place in our car and probably took place in yours as well. It happened between my father and my mother, and it concerned when exactly was the best time or the proper time to stop and actually refuel the car. And so with that, I will read you a short passage from the book. Even when we managed to remain on the highway, we found trouble on occasion. Sometimes it was our own fault, and by our, I mean it was my dad's fault. Such was the case with a series of heated skirmishes between Mom and Dad in what came to be known as the Battle of E. The E in question referred to the letter on our fuel gauge, the one indicating the gas tank was empty. At least it indicated such to most people. To my father, the E stood for something more like, a sort of half-hearted heads up that somewhere along the next 100 miles, if it was convenient, it might be good to look for an exit with a service station. Well, based on previous experience and an understanding of automotive engineering standards known only to him, my father claimed that every automaker made sure at least 40 miles worth of gas remained in the tank after the needle dropped to E and the low fuel light blinked on. He insisted that engineers intentionally calibrated fuel gauges to be on the safe side. To be fair, my father had gathered considerable support for his case, having personally tested his theory many times over the years, much to our collective dismay. And though we'd never run out of gas, I was positive that on more than one occasion, we'd rolled up to a fuel pump on nothing but the last lingering fumes remaining in the carburetor. As a rule, the needle of our fuel gauge would always drop to E when we were as far as possible from, well, anywhere. In the 1970s, this was a much easier place to be. There was far less development, particularly along the new interstates. Urban sprawl was still in its infancy, making the distance between cities seem far greater. What's more, there were fewer exits with services along the interstates. In fact, when the routes of the interstates were being determined, one of the main objectives was to bypass towns where services such as gas stations and restaurants were already located. This was to hold down costs, as real estate in developed areas was much more expensive. Making matters worse, our family trips nearly always led us into the deep South. We traveled through large swaths of Tennessee, Arkansas, Mississippi, and Louisiana, some of the least developed and most sparsely populated areas east of the Mississippi. As a result, my father's stubbornness in pushing the limits of our fuel tank often left us facing the possibility of spending much of our vacation stranded on the shoulder of a lonely highway rather than relaxing on a sunny beach. My parents' difference of opinion over the best time to refuel made for some uneasy moments. Upon seeing the fuel needle drop below a quarter tank, my mom would begin dropping not so subtle hints. "We should probably think about getting gas soon," she casually mentioned to my dad. "There's an exit coming up. I think I saw a sign a ways back." "We've got plenty of fuel yet," my dad would respond. "No sense stopping any sooner than we have to. Why, we'll lose 20 minutes just getting off and on the highway." It's here that I should point out my father's motivation for stretching every tank. He was obsessed with what he called making time. Essentially, making time meant nothing more than progressing towards the day's destination as quickly as we could. It was a sort of competition between my father and the laws of physics. He just wanted to get wherever we were headed in a time faster than should be possible. "Hey, we're making great time, everybody," Dad would announce at random intervals. "We're averaging 57.3 miles per hour with stops. At this rate, we'll make Murfreesboro by 6. Of course, it made no difference if we made Murfreesboro by 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, or 10 o'clock. But for my father, that wasn't the point. He just wanted to prove that it could be done. In his ongoing quest to make time, my father was relentless. Speed limits were pushed, meals skipped, requests for potty stops mercilessly ignored. To this day, I'm convinced that my bladder is stretched to 6 times the size of the average human's because of the countless hours I spent holding my pee as a child in the cause of making time. As the miles passed and the needle dropped lower, my mom's comments would grow more pointed. "We're on E now, Chuck. We should get off at the next exit." At this point, Dad would employ his favorite delaying gambit, the small town up ahead with added bonus. "You know, hun, we should be able to make Bumbleberg no problem," he'd begin. "It's just a few miles further, and I think they have a McDonald's there too. We could get gas, coffee, and burgers for the kids all in one stop." And with that, we'd pass by that next exit with its easy off-ramp leading directly into a brightly lit Sinclair gas station just off the interstate. Without fail, just past the exit, we'd see a road sign listing the distances to upcoming towns and destinations. Sure, there might be exits for a town or two in the next 10 miles, but they would have names like Dyersville or Desperation Point. What's more, A quick check of the triptych would show that although they had exits, the actual towns lay literally off the side of the map and had no symbols for services for any kind. Then at the very bottom of the road sign, we'd see the town that Dad had mentioned as our destination and its distance, 39 miles. It was at this point, as we continued a highway suddenly devoid of other traffic, that our car would grow very quiet. We would each retreat into our private worlds, hoping against hope that Dad's theory held water, not to mention 40 miles worth of fuel. As the reality of our situation settled in, Mom would read Dad the riot act. She might even work in a few tears as she'd let loose about how he never listened to her about filling up when it was convenient, how he always had to push it. Ever the cool customer, Dad would confidently reply that there was nothing to worry about. We'd make it to Bumblebird with fuel to spare. But afterward, he'd become as silent as the rest of us, knowing deep down it was going to be close. And though we'd all been down this road many times before, literally and figuratively, he knew that this might just be the night that this might just be the day that his luck would run out. As the minutes passed along with the miles, we'd all edge up on our seats and crane our necks to get a better look at the fuel gauge. Just as the fuel needle would drop below the white line pointing to E, we'd see the next roadside. Bumblebird, 17 miles. We'd swallow hard and our eyes would dart from side to side, like the crowd following the action at a tennis match. We'd go from the fuel gauge to the road, to the fuel gauge, to the road, searching desperately for an illuminated sign, a billboard, any trace whatsoever of civilization ahead. More than once, I'd also looked over at Dad to see the calm expression on his face, betrayed by tiny beads of perspiration. Whether by divine intervention or sheer luck, we always made it to Bumblebird or Snipesville or whatever other town would be our salvation. Like the lookout up in a ship's crow's nest searching for land, one of us would finally thrust a finger forward and cry out that a gas station sign was jutting up from the horizon. Then we'd sweat out a few last anxious moments as our car coasted on its last drops of fuel into the station and right up to the gas pump. Without a word, we'd simultaneously pop open our car doors, as much to release the pent-up tension as to file outside to use the restroom and offer up a silent prayer of thanks. After a short break, we'd return to our seats and head back out on the highway, only to repeat the whole episode all over again, exactly one tank full of gas later. Thank you so much. Appreciate you guys joining me tonight. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and pick up the book if you want to hop in for a fun ride. At this point, I am happy to take any questions that anybody might have. Crystal, you might want to open up the muting, I guess, and happy to answer any questions about road trips or publishing, publishing process. Any questions that you may have on your mind.
Yes, thank you so much. If anybody wants to unmute themselves to ask a question or type it in the chat box.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Rich, I was wondering, I saw a program on PBS a few months back and didn't catch the name of it. It was about how the committee or board put together a road trip to promote the federal parks. And so they did a very specific road trip and went to each park all throughout the United States. I was just wondering if you were familiar with that and knew the name of it.
And that's something that is recent, that's ongoing?
Well, I guess they played it before, but it was back in when some of the roads they couldn't even, it was back using the old cars and so forth. And as when they first started with building the federal parks and the lodges and things. So they were going to each state with these federal lodges and things. And then there were some roads that they couldn't get through.
Oh, very
so they had to leave it out.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the specific program or effort that you're talking about, but boy, that sounds like something I would be very interested in. Was it a dedicated caravan and people would travel in a group in these old
Yes.
classic cars? You know, maybe I
It
did
sounded,
about that.
it sounded like, I'm sorry, it sounded like it was a committee of some sort from Washington, DC, or the Congress or the Senate or something that was trying to promote the federal parks. And so I thought, what kind of a job is that? I would have loved to have done that.
Absolutely. I would have loved to have been part of that as well. I do know that there was a program a few years back. I believe it was to celebrate the 150th, I want to say, anniversary of the opening of the first national park in America. And I know that they were offering, I think, free admission, at least for children under the age of 16 or something like that. I knew about that program, but I'm not familiar with the program that you're talking about. Sorry, I can't provide any more detail on that.
Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. Anyone else have any questions?
We've got some thank yous in the chat. I'm curious to know, what was your favorite family road trip?
Yes, that's a question I am asked more often, or quite often. And actually, I think I have a surprising answer for you. It wasn't any of the family trips that I took with my own siblings and own parents. It was actually a trip that I took with my wife and kids. I have two sons. They're now 17 and 15, probably not as excited about road trips now as they were a few years ago. But just a few years ago, I think it was 5 years ago, I'd always traveled by car and I wanted to get the experience of traveling in an RV. Now, I didn't want to have the commitment of actually buying an RV. So we rented one of those Cruise America RVs to kind of, get a taste for the experience. I live in Wisconsin. We actually had to drive down to Northern Illinois to pick up the RV. And then we got in there. So we started in Illinois and we spent as our final destination, Mount Rushmore. I wanted to take that quintessential American trip, out to Mount Rushmore and go through South Dakota and the Badlands and all of that and go to Wall Drug. But on our way, it wasn't, Mount Rushmore was fantastic. It was a great final destination. But what really made that trip my favorite was all the little stops that we would take along the way. Because I'm the complete opposite father that my own father was. He was all about getting to that final destination, about making time. And I love to stop at every rinky-dink little attraction along the way. And some of the attractions that we stopped at weren't rinky-dink at all. They were fantastic. So in Iowa, we stopped off at the Field of Dreams, the place where they filmed the actual movie Field of Dreams. My son is a big baseball player. I am a baseball coach. And so that was a fantastic experience for us, for a father and son, to get to play an actual game of catch on the actual Field of Dreams. A few hundred miles to the west of there, we stopped off at the Surf Ballroom, which is the last venue where Buddy Holly and the Big Bopper and Richie Valens played before boarding an airplane that crashed into a nearby cornfield. And that was the day the music died, of course. But that venue is still kept as kind of a museum to them and all the great music of the 1950s and 60s. So that was a fantastic stop off. One of my favorites was in South Dakota at the same exit that you take to get off to go for a car tour of the Badlands. There's also the National Minuteman Missile Historic Site. Of course, during the Cold War, South Dakota was a place where America kept its arsenal of Minuteman missiles, and you can still go visit those missiles, the ones that would have had the nuclear warheads on them and that we would have launched if we were attacked during that period of time. You can still go see these missiles in some of their silos out there. And it was an absolutely fascinating experience. And then of course, we eventually made it to Mount Rushmore, and that was great. And one of the most stirring experiences is going to Mount Rushmore on a Sunday night when they play the national anthem and they invite anybody in the crowd that has served in America's armed forces. They invite them to come up to the stage and they interview some of them. And it's a chance for, for us as citizens to kind of give them our thanks for their service to America. And it was it's a really special experience. So that was really my favorite trip that we've taken.
Great, thank you.
Why do the station wagons have those wood panels on the side?
Everybody wants to know that. You're going to make me give up one of the quick minutes from the book. The origins of the station wagon are actually hinted at in their name, station wagon. Originally, these were wagons or vehicles to be used around stations, train stations. Because when cars were first being developed around the turn of the century, the 1800s going into the 1900s, of course, trains were still the dominant form of long distance transportation. But what was still needed was a means to get train passengers from their homes to the actual train stations and also to carry their big trunks that they wanted to take along with them. And up until the invention of automobiles, of course, that kind of niche had been filled by horse carriages, but those were slow and cumbersome, and of course you had to have an animal attached. And so when cars came along, they were the logical vehicle to take the place. But none of the original car manufacturers built vehicles that could accommodate these huge travel trunks that train passengers wanted to take. And so what would happen is just independent handymen and craftsmen would buy up like your standard Model T, and then they would hack off the metal body of the Model T behind the windshield, and they would recreate an entirely new body in wood that in such a way that it would accommodate passengers, a driver up front, of course, and then passengers. And then, of course, they would have a long area, cargo area, to accommodate these travel trunks that train passengers would have. And so you would have a half metal, half wood car that became to be known as station wagons. And over the course of time, of course, station wagons continued to be built in wood. It became kind of a tradition. In fact, I'm sure many of you are familiar with like the woodies that became so endeared to surfers, and that you'll hear references to woodies in many of the great surf songs of the 1960s. Well, what they were referring to were these wood-bodied station wagons. But then, as I explained during my presentation, car manufacturers got a lot better working with steel following World War II and started making station wagons entirely out of steel. But kind of as an homage to the original station wagons, they would still apply, these fake wood paneled stickers along the sides of the station wagon, just as kind of an homage and out of sheer tradition for, how station wagons came to be. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. We had another one?
Yes. Did your family ever have to spend the night in the car?
Ha 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 ha. No,
Ours did. Ours did.
We came close several times, and
We did. 5 of us in a minivan. Yep.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure that was it became a beloved family story then. And
Oh yes. The night mommy had a nervous breakdown. Yes, the kids loved it and told everybody when they asked, what was your favorite part of the trip? We drove cross country, mind you. Saw the Alamo, which I thought, this is it. My husband talked about it for years. And when we got there with a McDonald's across the street, I could not believe this is it. Okay. And then we just continued on and on. And oh boy, we saw everything.
Yep. And so it seems like it's always the worst of experiences that make for the best of stories, right?
But I could not believe, out of all the things we saw, the kids said, oh, the night we spent in the car.
And those are the types of experiences that you can only have when you actually hit the road and kind of set off on this great expedition together as a family and really travel through America instead of flying over it. And you really, get a taste for the country and all the great people that you meet along the way and all of the attractions that you see along the way. Those are the type of experiences that you can only have when you go on an actual road trip. And that's why, I think road trips are making a bit of a comeback these days, and it's very heartening to see. And I hope, many of these young families discover for themselves what makes these great road trips so memorable, and why they're so beloved, and why so many of us fondly recall them to this day. Anything else? Any other questions? Any aspiring authors or anything out there? Questions? No, I guess not. Okay. Well, in the end, I just want to thank you. I hope you enjoyed my presentation tonight, and I hope I stirred up some fun memories for you. I'm sure many of you I know have stories and experiences of your own, and hopefully some of the things I brought up tonight, helped you think about those things like you haven't thought about them in years. But thank you so much for giving me your time and attention, and I hope you'll learned a thing or two and also had a laugh along the way.
Very much.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Good night.